Hi, everybody. My name is is Jason Diamond. I work for Developmentor. You may have caught some of our webinars, webcasts in the past. We're starting to do more on Node.js, and today's topic is a particular framework for Node.js for writing web applications. So I'm going to jump right in. If you don't know what Node.js is, or you want a little bit of an introduction to that, you can find a previous webcast that we did. Let me actually bring that up. Oops, it looks like my VM was asleep. So at the develop.com website, we have a webcast link at the top in the nav bar, and you can see all the previous, well, here's me and this one today. Previous webcasts that happened. We had one for Introduction to Node.js for .NET developers. I don't know where it is in the list, but it's there it is. It's near the top. I guess it's sorted in reverse. So if you need an introduction to Node, you can take a peek at that. We're going to look a little bit deeper at Express.js today. Express.js being a web application framework for Node.js. So when you're coming to a new environment or a new platform, joining a new community, really, they have new words for everything, and you kind of need to, or at least I need to, associate these new words with the old words I'm familiar with. So just to recap, Node.js is kind of like .NET in that it is a platform on which you can write all sorts of web applications. I said web application there, but all sorts of applications. They don't have to be web applications. But Node has a reputation for being a web application framework or platform, right? You write web app with Node, but that's just its common perception. It's not actually what it is. It's more general purpose than that. So Node.js is strongly geared towards writing network-based and therefore web-based applications, but really it has very little support for getting a meaty app done in a way that you'd be satisfied with if you use any other framework, for example. If you use ASP.NET Web Forms or MVC or Ruby on Rails or any of the struts frameworks and very many other frameworks from in the Java space. There's a lot of frameworks in the PHP space as well. CodeIgniter is a popular one. These things are all extra packages or frameworks on top of the platform itself, right? ASP.NET's MVC sits on top of .NET. Express sits on top of Node.js, right? So keep that in mind, and why we're talking specifically about Express as one option for writing web apps on the Node.js platform. It's just one option, but it is the most dominant option. When it comes to writing web apps, pretty much everybody goes directly to Express. And I'm not trying to make any sort of claim that it's the best, but it's the one that I use and the one that I see most people talking about. But there's alternatives, of course. In the open source community, people love to write new frameworks, and so there's lots to choose from. But Express is very minimal, but it gets the job done. So over the course of the next hour, we'll talk about this framework, Express, that sits on top of Node, and we'll do it in Windows. So I have Windows VM ready, and hopefully by the end we can push to Windows Azure. But everything that you see me do can be done on any OS. And one of the neat things about Node is its cross-platform nature, and in my day job, I work at a Windows shop like most enterprise companies. And we develop on Node.js apps there on Windows machines. We even host our internal servers for testing on Windows machines. But when we push to the cloud, we're being hosted on Linux machines. They're much cheaper. And some of our developers, including myself, when I'm at home or on the weekends and doing work, I work on a Mac. So Node.js doesn't really care what platform you're on. As long as you have Node installed, you're good to go. And getting Node installed on Windows is really easy. So I'm not going to detail it, but click the big install button, download the MSI, click next all the way through the installer, and eventually you'll have in your console Node.exe available. You can see I've got the latest version, 10.26. Along with Node comes a program called NPM, which stands for Node Package Manager. It's kind of like NuGet for Node. So we've got these two things installed and I can start using them. And we need Node. This is our platform, the thing that runs the JavaScript that executes the code. And we need NPM to get Express and everything that Express depends on. So once you've installed Node, you're good to go. And we'll assume you've already done that. Now, a lot of us may be .NET developers. We may use Visual Studio. I'm going to use Sublime just to prove that there's nothing Windows specific or Visual Studio specific about this, and just to reinforce the fact that it can work on any OS. And our style at Develop Mentor, are the way that we approach a lot of instructing on these new frameworks and platforms is to build things from the ground up. And so when you have a tool like Visual Studio that can generate a bunch of code for you, it hides or obfuscates a lot of what's going on under the covers, and that doesn't make it easy for training purposes to talk about what's happening. And so by the time we're done, I will open Visual Studio and I will use the project template to generate an application, but you'll see that it's slightly different and you'll kind of understand why I chose to do things from scratch, if you will. So let's talk about Express. I'm not going to spend too much time in slides, but we do have some, and I'll make these available as a PDF file after the fact, along with all the demo code that you see me type in. The recording itself will also be available. That usually takes a couple of days to become available, and everybody who signed up should receive an email when that's available. That's my understanding. If it's not, then hopefully somebody can let me know. So to answer the questions, yes, this is being recorded, and you will be able to watch it at your leisure. So we'll talk about installing Express, how to get started with an application, and define our routes being the URLs that our clients interact with our app. They type in URLs in the address bar, and we spit out HTML or JSON or whatever it is at them. Spitting out that HTML usually is done with some sort of view engine, and so we'll see a couple of options and how those plug into Express. But we won't spend too much time on selecting the best one, because there is no best one. We all have different preferences, and you can plug in the one that works best for you. But Express is known for its pluggability and extensibility, and how you can extend it with what they call middleware. If you do .NET development and you've been following the new ASP.NET stuff with Owen and Katana, then you're probably already familiar with the concept of middleware. Express has the exact same concept, but it had it before. So it's been out for several years now, and it's different. So we'll see that it's very simple, and how we'll plug in some middleware in order to help us get our app done, and use middleware to serve static files and to handle errors. But hopefully by the time we're done, we'll get to see a little tip on how to structure our applications, to modularize our routes and put them in different files, and then we'll push it to Windows Azure if we have time. So we totally should. So first off, we need Express. So as a prerequisite to this, I said that you have to have Node installed. So if you've got Node installed, then you've got NPM installed. And NPM is the way that we're going to get Express. And you can see the command to type this in. It's really easy. NPM install whatever package it is that you want. I'm going to flip back to Windows. And down here in the command prompt that I have at the bottom, I can type in NPM install Express. And we'll see NPM reach out to the web and download the latest version of NPM and save it in a folder that you can already see up here called Node Modules. This Node Modules is kind of like the bin folder for your application, and everything that you depend on gets put in here. So it put Express in there. Now Express it's not huge, but it does have an awful lot of dependencies. You can see some of these dependencies down here that got downloaded. If we were to dig into here, and there's really no reason to do this, we can eventually see Express's Node Modules folder, and they have modules that may have Node Modules folder, so we've got dependencies inside dependencies inside dependencies. NPM takes care of all of that for us. All we really care about, though, is that we have Express, this top-level module installed. And that's all we need to get started writing our application. And to write our application, we're going to create a JavaScript file, and we'll call it app.js. Its name is totally unimportant, but you need some script for Node to run. So Node, remember, is the executable down here in the command prompt. We will eventually, I don't know where everything went, we'll eventually run node app.js. And, well, he just ran this empty file, and of course nothing happened. But we will eventually add some code into this file and see stuff happen. We'll see a web server appear. And that's actually a pretty common first thing that people look at when they're doing their first Node application, because here on Node.js.org's homepage, if you scroll down a tiny bit, the sample code they have here is a web server. What's interesting about Node, and other platforms are following suit here, is that it's not intended to be hosted inside some container, right? When you write a PHP application, you put it inside Apache, right? Apache has to support PHP. When you write an ASP.NET application, you put it inside IIS, right? Those things contain your application. Node apps, on the other hand, if they want a web server, they import or require the HTTP module, the module that implements the HTTP protocol, and they host their own server. So take this, copy, and back to the text editor, paste, save, rerun node app.js, and now there is a server running on port 1337, only listening on my local IP address, so you can't hit this from your machines, obviously. But if I hit this, we can see hello world. Right, and if we take a little peek at the code, we can see that we're creating a server, passing in this callback function right here, and he is setting on the response object this right head, so the head of the response, and then ending the response with the string hello world. Okay, cool. This is hello world for Node.js. It's writing your own web server with a tiny bit of code. And this comes with Node.js core. When I say Node.js core, that means we didn't need anything inside our Node modules folder. We didn't need Express. This stuff is built into Node. But it's too low level. You can pass in one function to create server, and that one function has to know about all your routes, has to know how to do everything for your application, and that's not the way that we want to structure our applications with a single function. Instead, we're going to leverage the power of Express by requiring it in our code. And this function right here is Node's way of loading a module. And just like adding a reference in .NET or adding a jar file or a class path in Java, we have to make sure the module is installed. It's inside our Node modules folder, and we have to load it into the current runtime. All right, so now this module is loaded, we can start using it. And one thing that's very surprising about the Express module is it's just a function. Let's get rid of this hello world stuff. We don't need to see that. But Express is just a function. So you use it as a factory for applications. Right? And that's the extent of what we use this Express module for. But of course, the object that got returned from that has quite a bit of methods that we're going to want to use. What's surprising, though, is that this object is, again, just a function, right? And so we could invoke this and pass in some rec object and request object and some response object, and it would do application stuff, and that would make it easy for us to unit test, but we're not going to really use it at that high of a level. We're not really going to talk about tests. But in the JavaScript world, things are in the Node.js version of JavaScript, I should say. The community really likes small, focus models that do one thing. Express isn't the best example of that because it does a lot of things, but it tries to really embrace that philosophy of small, cohesive modules that do one thing and only one thing, and they do it well. But of course, a web app framework has to do an awful lot. And one of the things it has to do is, since this is Node, is to implement a web server that will listen to requests on some port so that it can respond and render views and emit JSON and talk to the database, whatever it is that has to do. We're going to invoke this listen method on the application object and tell it what port to use. And this is very reminiscent to what we did down below, where we created a server and we told that server object to listen on this port, bind it to this IP address, We don't need to do that, but I will pass in a function object here that, that will get invoked when the port is bound and ready on port 1337. So this will be a hint to us that the application is ready to go. As you may have noticed, I just noticed right now, Node was running the whole time I was typing in this file. I just saved it. Node does not know to reload the file. Of course, there's lots of ways around this. I use, during development, a program called NodeMon. It looks a little bit like NodeDaemon, but NodeMon is the program that will watch your source code, and when they change, they'll restart the Node process. We don't really need that for now, but if I wanted to, it's a 1 npm install away. So we'll just leave that off for now. Instead, just restart the application. So it's now listening on port 1337. And what is it doing? Well, it's not doing anything yet. Unlike the example we had before where I was actually emitting some sort of response, we're not doing that currently. So we need to actually add a little bit more to the app that we've written so far before it'll actually do anything. And one of the things that we're going to want to configure here is some routes. And usually in a Node, an Express app, you configure the application, you use middleware, so you figure out what middleware you need to use and you register it with the application and you define your routes. I'll just add some comments here so that we can get a feel for what we're going to do, what we're going to add to our app as we go. And really the first thing that you probably need to do just to ensure that everything is working correctly is to have at least one route defined. So let's define our first route, and we do that with the app object that was returned from the Express factory function. And it has a bunch of methods that remind you of the HTTP methods. Sometimes we'll call these verbs. So you can get a resource, you can post, you can put, you can delete, you can head, you can options. There's about 10 or so different HTTP methods that you can mention their name here. So whenever this URL right there, / the root of my application is get from, I don't know how to say this, but whenever a browser or whatever client it uses the get HTTP method on this URL, we're going to respond with this function right here. And notice how the function takes in a request object and a response object. A lot like the example that we saw earlier. So a function that takes in a request and a response. This is the example from the Node.js homepage. So here inside the callback function for my route, for the root of my application, I will say, hey res, response object, I'm going to write hello express here. So we see something different. And this is, I think this is the minimal application that you need in order to boot up Express. So let's stop, we'll Control C in the console, press up and enter just to restart the application. He's listening on port 1337 again. We'll switch back to our browser, and it previously said hello world, but it should change to hello express, and it did. Sorry if that's so small. So this send method sent a response to the client, whatever the client happened to be. In this case, the client was a browser. There's lots of different ways you can respond to requests with Express. And let's catch up with the slides really briefly so that we could see a little bit of what I glossed over in terms of configuring a little bit of stuff. There's a method called app.set that lets you set configuration settings on your application. There's a list of standard settings that Express uses, and you can get this directly from their documentation. The ones that people mostly set are these two down here at the bottom, what view engine are you using and what directory actually contains your views. The rest are used a little bit less rarely. Maybe env is used quite a bit because you want to set the environment mode to development when you're developing so that it doesn't cache things in memory. It's not as efficient, but you want those features. But you might want to set it to production when you actually deploy to turn those developer-friendly features off. But you can set whatever setting you want, and so you can make up, for example, a title and store it there. But when we go to define our routes, we use these get, post, put, delete methods, etc. And notice how you can have, in this example on the slide, get for /login and post for /login, right? Two different methods being handled on the same URL, but obviously in different ways. When you get /login, the client probably wants to see the form that they type their username and password into in order to log in. When you post to /login, that form is probably supplying the username and password to the server so it can validate the password and turn that into a cookie or some sort of token that it can give to the client. All right, so it's really common to have multiple methods on the same URL. And these URLs can have patterns in them. In this example, we can see that the /API/user/ something here is a pattern where that :ID ends up getting extracted from the URL and put on this request.params.id property. So we can then use that to fetch the user object from the database and then format it as JSON, JSON, and send it to the client. If you have complex constraints that you want to put on these patterns, you can use regular expressions. And so here's a more complicated example here on the same slide that's saying /API/history and then 4 numeric digits. So apparently we want the year here. And we are reaching inside rec.params and grabbing the first captcha group. When you use regular expressions, your captcha groups don't have names, so you use indices. It's zero-based. So this would give us the year. Because it comes back as a string, I'm parsing it as an integer. This is just normal JavaScript stuff, normal regular expressions. Of course, Express mapping this into rec.params or this into rec.params is unique to Express. But choose the one that is appropriate for what you need. I do almost entirely string-based routes in my apps. I guess that maybe they're boring or I'm not creative enough to need this kind of complexity. But it works really well for me. And there's some limited support for wildcards. You can, for example, use the star, the asterisk character in here. So saying you don't care about what the name is, for example, in /user/, you put a star there. So whatever it is they're trying to load has an ID. I'm not sure that makes sense. But there's some flexibility here in how you define these. Keep in mind that these parameters are in the URL, not in the query string part. So the query string part is totally separate and not considered part of the route, but you can still access that. And that request object that comes in to your callback function has a query parameter, for example. We saw params, that's the stuff inside the URL. Query is the stuff inside the query string after the question mark. Headers are retrieved with the get method. Cookies are available hanging off this object. The body, if it was parsed, is hanging off this property, so rec.body. But notice that these two properties, cookies and body, both require middleware to be installed into the application. Otherwise, they're undefined. They're not going to be used. So we'll get to that in a bit. When I need to use the body, I'll have to install some middleware. But there's a variety of other properties here that you can look at the request object. And this isn't all of them. These are just the more common ones. But for the most part, I get things from params and query. Less often, I get often enough from query. Like if I'm doing paging and I want to know what the offset is and the page size, it's usually put inside the query string section. Cookies, I normally let middleware deal with that for me, so I don't actually mess with the cookies that much myself. Usually your authentication cookie, like who you logged in as, there's plenty of middleware out there that you can find, and I'll talk briefly about it towards the end. The one that I use the most, that I think is used the most by most apps, Passport.js, for doing authentication. But the body I access quite a bit in post callback handlers, for example. When somebody's submitting some data to our site, we need to reach inside the body and grab that data and do stuff with it. So we'll see how to get access to these. But before we start posting data to the server, we kind of need a form that our users can start adding data to so they can submit it. right? We need that in order to get data in a request first. So kind of a chicken and an egg problem. And so let's talk about responses. So remember, every one of these callback functions gets passed in a request object and a response object. And there's lots of different ways to respond to requests. You can set headers, you can set cookies, you can redirect them to some other URL, pass in the kind of redirect if you want permanent or temporary as the first number in the URL as the second argument to this function. You can send like I just did. I don't use send that frequently, but if you give it a string, it tells the client, here's some HTML. If you give it a buffer, it tells the client, here's an octet stream, here's some binary data. If you give it an object or an array, it tells the client, here comes some JSON. So it stringifies it for you automatically. It seems like it's a convenient method, but I tend to use JSON directly. So the JSON method directly takes whatever JavaScript value you give it and stringifies it. When I'm trying to generate HTML, I don't send a string of HTML. Right? I'm not going to do this. Put HTML inside strings inside my JavaScript. That would be much too painful to have to work with. Instead, I'm going to use this much more handy method called res.render, which is one of the main, besides routing, of the main features that Express gives us, which is a uniform view engine. So Express does not come with a view engine, but it has support for pretty much all the view engines that are out there. They all have a similar signature, and you can configure most view engines to work with Express almost out of the box and do very little to get it to work. But we need to render here some view, and we'll render index. So if this is the root of our application, we'll create a view called index, and we'll render that. Now, in most Express applications, there's a folder called views, and inside that there's files named after the views, and they have whatever extension they need to have. And I just chose HTML, but that's probably not the extension I want to use. Instead, I think I'll rename this file to be index.ejs. EJS means embedded JavaScript, and it's basically still a HTML file, right? So here's my app, and we'll stick a H1 down here. But you can have little snippets of JavaScript in here, and when you see the syntax, you're going to think it's immediately familiar. Less than percent equals. It kind of reminds us a lot of classic ASP, or even web forms if you were doing it that way. I don't know why you would. But put whatever value you want here. I'll just show the current time. So let's instantiate a new data object, which is the current time, and we should see that in our browser. When we fetch the slash, the root of our application URL, index should get rendered. So restart the application. It's ready again. We'll switch back to our browser and refresh, and oh no, we got an error. So no default engine was specified. Now we get a chance to actually configure the application and set those settings that I said were pretty common. So this error, which is kind of difficult to read when it's all in one line like that, wants us to specify a view engine, and to do that we are going to, in the configure app section, app.set view engine will be EJS. I also want to make sure that I set my views folder to be this folder right here. You can usually get away with not setting this when you just get started, but by the time you go to deploy, you're going to find out that the directory that you're in when you deploy is different from the directory that contains this, and things aren't set up correctly. So let's take the current folder, and in Node.js, there's a magic variable that all scripts have called __dir_name, which is the folder that contains this script right here, regardless of what the current working directory is. Right? So take that current folder and join it, path.join, with the string views, which is what I called the folder right there. I hope that's clear. This path.join method doesn't exist, so I'm going to have to require it. Require path. I don't have to install the path module because this is a standard or core Node.js module that just comes with Node, but you do have to load it into your script. So we should require it into some variable, and we should be good. Back to our command prompt, terminate it, restart. And we come and refresh in here. We're still going to see an error, but it's a different error. As long as the error message changes, we're making progress. So this time it says cannot find module EJS. When I set the view engine to EJS, Express tried to then find the implementation of that view engine by requiring that string. So he assumes that the module that implements the view engine has the same name as the view engine. So EJS needs to be installed into Node modules, otherwise Express is going to show us this error, which you see it doing. So let's go back to our terminal, terminate the app, and npm install. If you don't want to type the word install in its entirety, you can just type npm I, which I'm lazy, I do quite a bit. npm I EJS. So install EJS into the local Node modules folder. And there it is. We can see it just appeared. Now, I don't have to require EJS in here. Express is going to do it for us. Remember, we saw the error message when he tried and failed because it wasn't installed. Now we refresh, and the current time is 1:31. So refresh, and we can see that change, 1:32. So we've got some simple view being rendered here, index.ejs. It's not that impressive since it's just outputting a single dynamic value, if you will. Let's do something a little bit more interesting. In a normal application, you're going to do some sort of load data from DB here, and then you're going to want to render that data into whatever view we're giving to the user. And in the Express API, res.render takes in the name of the view to render, and remember he adds dot whatever the view engine is, and he looks inside whatever the views folder is to try to find it. But as a second argument, he takes in an object, and this object can have whatever it is that you need to render the view. These things are going to be available to us inside the EJS file. So let's just, as a simple example, pass in an array of items. We'll do like a to-do list style application. So ID 1, and the description is, foo. Don't have a good imagination, but we'll create a couple more of these objects. We'll pretend we got these out of the database. So we got this array of objects out of the database, and we're passing it to the view, and we're naming it items. These curly braces are just a normal JavaScript literal object. So you can have name, colon, value. In this case, the value is an array, so it looks more complicated than a normal. Simple value like a string would, for example, here. Now let's go to our view and try to use this. Let's use title, since we put it in the model, if you will. Title, and then let's get rid of that. Oops, sorry. Let's do a loop. So in the EJS syntax, it's very reminiscent of classic ASP, and I don't think anybody likes this syntax, but it's familiar, so most people should be okay with it, but loop over all the I is less than items.length and I++. So that begins the loop, and then this ends the loop. So we got our opening curly and our closing curly. In between that, we'll output a bunch of LIs, I guess. If we're outputting LIs, you probably want ULs around them. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong key. Making the window jump around. So we got this UL, and inside the LI, we'll output the, I guess just the description. items I.description. So it's totally normal JavaScript. I'm missing something here. Don't know what happened to that. Totally normal JavaScript, a normal for loop, and if you wanted to, you could have used the, I could have done less than percent items dot for each, use that newer method in ES5 and the more modern version of JavaScript instead of doing an old for loop like this. But no need to complicate things. We'll try to keep it simple and old school, I guess. Let's see what it looks like. Go back to our console, restart the app. Admittedly, it's annoying to do this, which is why almost everybody uses a tool like NodeMon or Forever or Supervisor. There's a bunch of them to choose from. If you're in a more full-featured IDE like Visual Studio or WebStorm from JetBrains, for example, you just press a button and it restarts the app and launches the browser for you. But we are showing how stuff works at the lowest level possible. But we can see now our data appeared. If we view source, we can see that the data was actually rendered into the HTML that was fed from the server to the client, my browser, which is why we see this rendered. So to send data back, remember that was our goal, was to render some sort of form that we can use to post back to the server. We'll add a form with the action of how about /add. And if this is a to-do app, we will have a input element, type equals text, yes, and a name of, how about new item. We're going to need a button. So input type equals submit. We probably want method to be post. That's probably the bare minimum I need to get this to appear. Now, I just changed the template, and previously, whenever I made a change to any of the code, I would come over here, I'd hit Control-C, up, and then Enter to restart the app. I don't have to do that when I'm changing the template because in development mode, the templates aren't cached. Every time a request is made, we reload the file from disk and recompile it and re-render the template. On production mode, that won't be the case anymore, but that's okay because you're not going to be editing live code in production mode on the server, I hope. But just something to keep in mind how things fit together and how they all work. Now I have my text box here, so let's go ahead and add a new item and then submit it to the server, and oops, there's a problem. The client tried to post a /add. The server said, you know what, I don't know what to do with that route, so I'm going to respond with this message right here. If we were to actually look at the network request that was just made, if I refresh and tell it to repost, we can see that it actually came back with a 404 error. So if I never define this route /add, that's the most appropriate message. Definitely 404. So let's go and define that. Back to our text editor and to the source code for the app. We will add a new route, app.post to /add, and he's going to take in a function, just like before. And at this point, we want to know what was added. We want to get access to what the user typed in. And if you've been doing web development for a while, you know the format that the browsers post data to us. And we can actually see that here in the browser. If I click on the request that failed, we can see that the content type is application /x form URL encoded. This is the query string format. You can actually see what it looks like. New item equals the value. If there was more than one value, there'd be ampersand, other item equals other value. So they're separate with ampersands, just like query strings are. So somehow we need Express to parse that for us. Because as it is, if I tried to reach into the request object and say body.newItem is this value, and let's just log it so we can see what we got, we'll be surprised that there's nothing there. Trigger another post, and we see an error right away. cannot read property new item of undefined at line 28. Let's go back to our text editor. Line 28 right here. Cannot read new item of undefined. That means body is undefined. Why is body undefined? Because Express comes with no middleware that knows how to parse the body of requests that were posted to the server. It seems like a surprising omission to me, but that's what they give us. And if we want to parse the body of requests that are posted to us, we need to install and register the middleware with our application. We have to choose what we need in order to function correctly. And it's a little bit of extra work, but the flexibility it gives not just us, but the Express developers, they can release Express as a shell of an application, just the framework, and then other modules can implement these required functionalities. So I'm going to find this other module, and I'm going to use it. This use method is a way for us to register middleware with the Express application so that it does its magic. And in this case, the magic is going to be, well, not that impressive. It's going to parse the body of the request, which is, again, kind of amazing to me that Express doesn't come with this feature built in, but it doesn't. And they have a good reason to. There was, in Express 3, there was a bug in the middleware that parsed requests. And in order to fix that bug, they had to release a new version of Express. They couldn't just release a new version of the module that did the body parsing. So in order to avoid that kind of you have to re-release the whole world problem, they decided to decompose Express into as many different modules as possible and put the burden on us to find the features that we need. This is a change in Express 4, which is the current version of Express that we're using right now. So it makes a little bit more for us on our part because Express does not come with all batteries included like it used to, but it's not that hard. I mean, you can set it up once and forget about it. So let's find the middleware that we need for Express and use it here. Now I have the Express website open. I haven't showed it yet, but expressjs.com is where you go to find all the documentation. So in my slides, I'm showing some of the methods and properties that are available on request and response objects. But if you hit API reference up here in the top of expressjs.com, you can see these different sections right here and see all the methods on requests, all the methods on responses. I wish it didn't scroll the way that it does. All the methods on responses. And then you can also see all the middleware that Express comes with. And Express comes with no middleware. Well, I take that back. It comes with one middleware called Express Static. We'll show this in just a bit. So in Express, prior to version 4, the current version, there was a bunch of middleware that Express came with, and that's what used to be here. So, but if you open this link, it shows you a list of all the middlewares that are moved into their own modules. We're in a different website now. And conveniently, the one that we want is right here at the very top, body parser. So if I npm install body parser, and then I require it, and then I app.use it, my application will know how to parse these requests that are coming in. We'll be able to get our data right here. So step number 1 is to install it. Stop the server, npm install body-parser. There's no way you would ever know to do this if it weren't for documentation and kind of discovering it on your own. I think that's always one of the downsides of using open source projects, is that it takes quite a bit of effort, I think, to get into it. But once you do, you start to, well, at least I start to feel a lot at home and able to do what I need. And if there's a bug, it's open source, I fix it and I send them a pull request and they'll accept it, hopefully. But that's installed now, so body parser now exists. Now I'm going to require it and load it into my application. And notice that the Node.js module naming convention uses dashes, but in JavaScript you can't have dashes in your variable names, so we have to change the convention slightly. That's okay. Down here we will then app.use body parser. And I think I actually have to use it in a different way. Let's click on the link. It's got a couple of options. oh, you have to use it as a function. So you invoke the function, and then it returns, I guess, the middleware. And one thing to point out here is that body parser is smart enough to parse both JSON requests and those URL encoder requests that we're currently looking at parsing right now. If you only want to parse one or the other, you can say body parser.json or body parser.url encoded. But I'll just go ahead and take both. Most apps these days are going to use both. So put my parentheses there. That's what I was missing. Now that I've installed it, required it, and used it, I registered this with the Express application. Body should no longer be undefined. This thing right here. Let's see if that's true. Back to our command prompt so we can restart the app. It's ready. Back to Chrome so we can refresh. He's going to post back to the server again for us. And we can see that it printed what I typed in. The error message is still on the screen. I actually have a problem. You can see here that in the status for this request says pending. This request is never going to end. So I made a mistake, and it wasn't on purpose. If we look at the method here, the callback function for the add route, where do I ever say, and your response is, like I do right here, I say res.render, you render this view, and the client gets a bunch of HTML, but down here in add, we never return a response to the client. And therefore, the request never ends, so the browser just ends up hanging forever. That was a mistake on my part, because I was debugging, trying to log what we got from the request instead of actually use it. So now that we know that we've got our new item and we saw it get logged at the console, let's actually use it. Let's stick it inside our list of to-do items, I guess. Let's extract this. To-do items. Let's make it a variable. And now I can to-do items.push, the method to add to arrays in JavaScript. This array wants a bunch of objects, and it looks like each object has a number and a description, and description will be our new item. The number, let's get that from, I guess, to-do items.length plus 1, something like that. So in a real application, of course, we would be writing to a database and letting it generate the primary key for us, and we'd be validating everything that was passed in. For now, we're just showing the mechanics of getting the data in and then doing something with it. Now that I've done something with the data, I still need to generate a response. In this case, and usually when I accept data via posting from some form in the client, I usually accept the data, then I redirect them to a page that shows them the data as it was saved. So let's res.redirect them back to slash. So this will send them a redirect, which will cause the browser to do a refresh or a request to slash, which will show all the items again with the new fourth item, hopefully. This has the advantage of, if they hit refresh, it's not going to show that scary prompt that says, are you sure you want me to submit the data again? You're going to buy this thing twice. Right? We don't want to scare our users, so doing a redirect after a post is a pretty common pattern. Let's restart the app. And let's start over. Let's go back to slash. So it looks like we're mostly empty. Do we need this open? Let's keep it open just in case. Submit something new. So after Baz comes Quux. And there it is. So we can keep adding stuff forever. And when we look inside the network pane, we can see the post and then the 302 redirect to slash, which causes us to re-get the current site. So pretty simple stuff within a single JavaScript file here. Let's add a bit more to it because this is not even close to ready to be a real app. We have some basic functionality here, and keep in mind that it's not persistent. As soon as I hit Control-C in the console and then restart the app, my saved items are not going to be saved anymore. So this is being stored in memory. You would never do this in a production site. But in most sites, there's more than just dynamic HTML like what we have here. There's static resources, And this gives us a good chance to talk about the one middleware that does come with Express, which is the static middleware. So in most pages, you have some sort of link to some style sheets, and there's not really a reason for those static CSS resources or files to be piped through a view engine. Unless you're dynamically generating CSS, you might as well just read the file directly. And so we're gonna set that up. So let's get from the CSS folder, style.css. Actually, let's try not to make it not look too terrible, and let's install Bootstrap. Okay, I never installed Bootstrap Bower in this VM. I'm currently installing if you didn't notice the command that I just typed in, I'll open a new prompt. What's going on? It's being slow. Is it done over here yet? I'm not sure why it's taking this guy so long to initialize. Doesn't normally do that. So we'll just wait for Bower to finish downloading. Okay, so Bower is a program that's kind of like NPM. By the way, this is the command I used to install Bower just now. npm install -g means global. That way Bower is in my path, so that I can type in Bower commands no matter what folder that I happen to be in. It's asking me a question, sure. And it's showing me the usage of it. Bower is kind of like NPM, but it's geared more for front-end JavaScript and CSS, not the back-end JavaScript like NPM focuses on. So NPM is normally for installing Node modules, and Bower is for installing the JavaScripts and CSS that you load into your browsers. So it's just another way of quickly downloading Bootstrap or any of the other thousands of packages that are on Bower. And since Bootstrap requires jQuery, jQuery is now downloaded as well, which was pretty darn convenient. I don't have to track down those dependencies and get everything that's required. But they put it inside this folder called Bower Components, just like NPM puts stuff inside Node modules. You can configure this to be something else, but I'm okay with the default. So Bower Components /bootstrap/css/bootstrap.css is probably the path that we need in order to get that CSS in the page. And if that's correct, then if we add a container around all the stuff that we have here, it should look a little bit better. Well, it should look different at least. Better is going to be a judgment call. So now that we have Bootstrap being referenced from our HTML, we want to be able to refresh our application and see the Bootstrap styles, but instead we see a 404. So from our point of view, this folder right here, Bower Components, exists. And clients should be able to request files inside that folder. But should they? Well, that depends on your application. Express will not serve any file that you don't give it permission to. So what we need to do is register another middleware that's going to use the app_use method, and this time we're going to register the express.static middleware. This is the one middleware that comes with Express in Express 4, the current version that we're using right now. The static middleware wants to know a folder that contains the files that it wants to serve for you without having to define a route. Honestly, you do not want to define a route for every, I didn't even get the path right. It's inside dist, isn't it? Yeah, there's where Bootstrap is. So you don't want to have to define a route for all of these files and for all those font files and for all these JavaScript files, right? You just want to say, hey, Express static middleware. You see that folder over there? The one called Bower Components /bootstrap/dist. I want you to serve that the contents of those files just send them directly to the client whenever they're requested. Don't bother me. Don't make me define one of these app.get things. All right, so this is a very useful middleware, and not surprising that it does come with Express, because you can't really write a web app without serving some CSS and JavaScript and other static resources. Images too, for example. You've got to have images and font files. There's a bunch of stuff that you don't want to define a route for. So the way, though, that I type this in with telling Express to serve files out of this dist folder means I'm going to have to change my URL, because the dist folder has CSS and fonts and JS, etc. So this is now exposed to us as if it's a root level folder in the website. And this is a bit confusing. I may have preferred to just serve the Bower components folder directly. That may be less confusing. Maybe I should do that. That would save me the trouble of having to also set up a static middleware for the jQuery folder as well. So I kind of like this idea of serving up the Bower components directly. Let's do that instead. So sorry for changing my mind. So Bower components, bootstrap /dist /CSS, and finally we get find our CSS file. So I hope that works. I think it should. Let's restart the app and see if this stuff changes. Oh, I still have a 404. So sad. Yes, okay. Because I am serving Bower components as the folder that contains my stuff, it should not be inside the path here. If I wanted to be inside the path, I would probably use a mount point. You can pass in an extra argument here at the beginning of use, and you can say this only applies at this path and below. But I don't want to do that. I kind of like how this looks, where I don't have to put the Bower word there. Let's try it again. I just changed the middleware. So we had to change code, stop and restart, and then refresh. And yay, the errors are gone, and the font changed ever so slightly. So not a huge difference, but it is a little bit different. And you can see the files being included, so it works. But let's get our other files, our JavaScript files as well. JavaScript files are normally included at the bottom of the page. So we're going to grab bootstrap, oops, got to spell that right, / I think it was dist /js, bootstrap.js. And Bootstrap requires jQuery, so we gotta find the path to jQuery. And it looks like it is also got dist in the name. So jQuery /dist /jQuery.js. That looks about right. I can grab the min versions instead if I was worried about efficiency. When I refresh, I should see that jQuery got requested and bootstrap.js got requested. We're good. We've got everything that we need in the page to write an application now. It'll look good because we got Bootstrap. It'll work in multiple browsers, different browser versions because we got jQuery. And it'll be easy and fun because we're using Express and Node on the server. Let's see where we are though. So we're serving some static resources. I'm feeling okay with what we've created so far. Let's catch up with the slides. I'll look at the questions that you may have typed in just a bit. We're going to push in just a bit. We can see this live on the internet. But the slides are talking briefly about view engines, and I did do this in the demo where we set views in view engine. We're using EJS in my example. By default, Express, well, if you use the Express generator, it comes with support for this template engine called Jade, which I don't like, but that's just me. A lot of people do like it though, but you can see the syntax is very terse, and instead of brackets everywhere, it uses white space and indentation, so it's kind of like Python or CoffeeScript. But this Jade file and this EJS file are the exact same thing. I'm toggling between the two right now. And so if you appreciate the terseness and the cleanliness of the Jade syntax, then give it a shot. If you want the more normal or traditional style syntax, then EJS or even handlebars are valid or pretty popular. Static files, we looked at middleware. Some other middleware that you may find really useful, stuff like Morgan is a logger. I don't think that's really that necessary, but cookie parser you got to use if you need to parse cookies at all. It also has support for signed cookies, so you have some secret shared on the server amongst all the nodes in your farm, and it will sign them all in the correct way, kind of like the machine secret in ASP.NET, so that you can prove that your cookies weren't tampered with. It has support for that. It makes it really easy for you not to even have to think about it. But you'll have to find middleware for your app at some point. And every middleware has a different API, different set of functionality that it exposes or adds to your application. You can see that favicon and cookie parser are kind of similar. Logger takes in some sort of mode parameter here. If you're in dev mode, it starts spitting out log lines to the console that a developer might appreciate, but you wouldn't have it turned on in production. Body parser, you can see here you've got options. So each one of these middlewares comes with different APIs for initializing them or configuring them, and you have to learn what those APIs are by reading the documentation. One of the things that every application needs is authentication, and we're going to completely ignore that for this webinar. We are almost out of time already. Passportjs.org, yep, is the right URL. This is the authentication middleware that I use in my app and my day job. So I work on Node apps full time. So we use Express with Passport, and it's very complicated to get this set up correctly. It supports both local authentication and using the new cool stuff like OpenID and OAuth, so you can log in with Facebook and Twitter. And there will probably be a Passport webinar added to the schedule pretty soon. So come back and see that, and we'll talk more about it. But this is a middleware that you probably need, because you don't want to have to deal with the issuing of the tokens and making sure the cookies are signed and all that kind of stuff yourself. So you want somebody else to take care of that for you, and Express makes it easy for you to install this and then use it, but it's not doable in just a few minutes, so we don't have enough time to go over it just yet. But this abundance of middleware that you can find on the web, there's almost all of it's on GitHub. But if you go to expressjs.com and click on that link that I did earlier, that was me. Where is that? That was right here. So let's go back to, I locked it. Sorry. When I switch between Windows and Mac, I get confused. Let's go back to expressjs.com. And my internet's so slow. I blame the broadcasting on my desktop. So I went to API reference. From there, I went to middleware. From there, we clicked on the link to the list of middleware, and we found a list of common middleware here. But there's dozens, if not hundreds, more to choose from. Most of them are not really worth writing yourself, or you could totally have written it yourself. A lot of them are little one-line middleware things. But why do it yourself if you can get away with letting somebody else do it for you? So, but this middleware is really easy to write. So here in this slide, it shows an example of a middleware that does logging. So app.use, but instead of passing in some module, we pass in a function. And notice how this function takes in a rec and a res, just like before, but also a next. And what's interesting about Express is that these callbacks that we have inside our code for our routes are middleware functions. They're just the end of the middleware line. So they generate the responses, which means there's nothing left to do. But these middlewares up here that we're registering, they intercept the request, do something to it, and then pass on the request to the next middleware in line. So, and it goes in order. So the body is being parsed before we serve the static resources, which actually seems like a waste. Let's serve the static resource, end the request, right? Give them the response, and be done with it. If, however, what they asked for wasn't a static resource, then we'll try parsing the body if there was a body defined. And then that'll get passed on to these routes down here. So the order that you include these things is important. But if you're writing your own middleware, switch back to the slide so we can see what that looks like. You do whatever it is that you got to do, and here we're just logging to the console. But then you call that next method. And if you don't call that next method, then you're going to prevent the request from ever finishing, which will hang in the browser forever. And you'll consume that connection on the server forever until it gets timed out by the browser or proxy. So if you are writing middleware, go ahead and do it. I don't write a lot, especially reusable middleware, but I do write some that's custom to my apps, and they're usually really small functions, kind of like this. Usually, I don't just log, but I'll do something like load the user dynamically if it sees it in the route or something simple like that. But I have to make sure I always call next, otherwise the route will never get it. There's one special kind of middleware, which are error handlers. And error handlers are middleware that have 4 arguments. You can see rec, res, and next, but the first one is error. And these names aren't important. You can call these whatever you want. But if you have 4, then you're an error handler middleware. And the idea behind error handling in Express is that if you encounter an error, you want to pass it on to the middleware that knows how to handle errors. And so you invoke next with your error object. That makes it skip all other middleware until it encounters a error handling middleware, one with 4 arguments. So here in this example right here, this really simple middleware with 4 arguments is handling errors. When it gets an error, it renders a view so that the user sees a nice error page instead of the ugly, here's a stack trace, which you don't want to show your users anyway, right? You want to hide that from them. For security reasons. But do what you need to do. And there is built-in error handling middleware. Well, there was an Express 3. I don't think there is an Express 4 anymore. Let's switch back to the code. So we've got an app. I don't think it was modified, but I don't think I had changed anything important in here. I'm not sure what I changed. So make sure it still works. Oops, don't want that. Reload the Node app and make sure that it still works. My app. Submit, and we got some data. All right. Now, the last thing I want to point out as far as your application code goes, is that you can structure this in any way you want. This is a single JavaScript file, this application right now. But as your app gets larger, and it's going to get large really fast, once you start talking to a database and authenticating users and doing all the auditing and validation, all the stuff that you got to do in normal apps, these things are going to start to blow up. Hopefully you can find ways to reuse them and hide reusable functionality in middleware or in external libraries. But just managing your routes can get somewhat burdensome. And so one of the things that Express 4 introduced, Express 4 is the current version of Express, is this idea of explicit routers. So I'm going to make a new module, I call it todos.js, and we will include or require Express into this module. Each one of these JavaScript files inside your application is its own scope, is its own set of local variables. So we have to require Express in each one of them. And in here, I'm going to create a router. So the idea behind creating your own custom router is that you can use those methods that we were looking at earlier, like slash, why am I typing it in? Let's copy it from over here. And put it in to-dos. We'll just change the word app to router. Oops, it looks like they're using this variable twice. So that variable needs to live here inside the other file. Define our routes, and our routes are now defined elsewhere. So we got to put something here to make up for what I just copied out. Here's our fake database, the to-do items. This should be okay. Now that I've constructed the router, I've defined a couple of routes, get and post on slash and slash add. I just now want to export the router, and we do that in the normal Node.js style, which is you assign to module.exports the thing that you want to expose to the world. That allows me from my app right here to say app.use require to-dos. So I can dynamically load this module, and all the routes that were added to it will now get added to my app. If I have more than one module with different sets of routes, I can go ahead and do this multiple times. If some of them are meant to be hosted under some sort of what Express calls a mount point, like for example, this is my API module for single page applications. Maybe I want all of its routes to be under /API. If we go then look inside that module, it doesn't exist, so I'm going to get rid of this. But if we're going to look inside it, like right here, /API, if I were to do that, then this means /API, this means /API/add, right? That mount point gets implicitly added in front of all the routes that we define inside here. And this code can be ignorant of that happening. So he doesn't have to know that we're defined under some subfolder, if you will. But that doesn't make sense for the app that we've got right now. I just want to make sure this continues to work. Oh no, we got errors. So cannot find module to-dos. That's right. Because if you require a module like this, it better be in the Node modules folder, or it better be part of Node.js core. But this is not. So you have to use a relative path. So /to-dos in order to find this module here inside this folder right here next to app.js. So we are listening, and it should be okay. We lost our data because it was stored in memory, but we'll add more. And there it is. We should be able to refresh and see the data stay there for as long as we keep the server in memory. So this feature of these child routers, if you will, if that's a good name for them, was added in Express 4. There was an equivalent to it in Express 3, but it wasn't as fully fleshed out. I like it a lot more here. But this is probably the closest thing we get to structuring our application, large applications. It kind of reminds me of MVC areas, if you had done that, but it's a lot simpler, right? It's just a way for you to factor out your routes in a separate module. So we can see this running on my machine. Let's now do a really quick push to the cloud, and just to make sure this works, and so you can get a feel for what that's like. And I'm going to use Windows Azure. So it's really surprising to a lot of people that Microsoft has embraced Azure. Node.js. Honestly, they don't care what language you use anymore. I think they're over trying to get everybody to use C# or VB or whatever language they think is theirs. If they can get you to give them money for hosting on Azure using Node or Ruby or PHP, they'll be happy to take your money. So it's, I guess, not too surprising that they support other platforms now, but it's different from the Microsoft that I grew up with. But I'm going to create a new website here. Let's make a new quick create, and we'll call it Hello Express, something cheesy. Oh no, it's taken. It's not taken by me. So Hello Express. How about Express-intro? Okay, cool. That one's okay. So I'm just making free sites here on Windows Azure. I had to give it my credit card number, but as far as I know, I'm not going to be tried. My free trial expired. At work, we don't use Azure, so we host on a different provider instead. It's Linux-based and a lot cheaper. But Azure's honestly a whole lot nicer. So it's going to create this, and it only takes half a minute or so. Once it's done, well, not even that long, once it's done, I'm going to be able to create a Git endpoint, and I mean Git, the version control system, like GitHub, but not using GitHub at all, just it's going to be hosted on Azure. So if I click on this, set up deployment from source control, it'll let me create a Git endpoint to use. And normally when you do this for the first time, it asks you for your username and password, but I've already done that with this account, so it's not asking me for that, but it's telling me the account that it knows that I have, which is JDiamond, my name, and it's giving me the URL to use to push to. So if I can push to that, then my code, my application will appear in the cloud. There's a couple of things that we got to do to make this happen, though. Number one is I got to check my code into Git. So I've already got Git installed on this machine. So Git is installed and it's available here via the command line. I'm a command line kind of guy. If you like UI tools, Visual Studio, or it has good support for Git now, I haven't used it just because we don't use Visual Studio to work on our Node.js apps. The IDE that we do use at work is WebStorm from JetBrains. Works on Mac and Windows the exact same way. JetBrains are the guys who make ReSharper, so it feels a lot like Visual Studio plus ReSharper. But I'm going to do it from the command line. I'm going to init a new Git repository here. And then I'm going to check all my code. Well, let's look at what code I have. It's a tiny bit bigger. We need to add app.js to the Git repo. We need to add Bower components to the Git repo. And to-dos.js and the views folder. I'm skipping node modules. I do not want that checked in. So all these files are about to get committed. I don't know if I have my shortcuts installed here. So first commit. Whatever makes sense. All that stuff was now committed to my Git repo. And I did not check in my node modules folder because who checks that in? Azure will read your dependencies for you automatically and install them for you in the cloud. But in order to do that, it has to know what your dependencies are, and it needs this file called package.json. And I just typed in npm init to get npm to generate a package.json for me. I'm just hitting enter past all the prompts in the console, and it just saved that file for me with my dependencies. And apparently I depend on body parser, EJS, and Express. Those are what you saw me type in, install, and then require. So this is enough to help Azure know what models it has to download once I push to it. But I should have probably done that before committing to Git. So let's add package.json to Git and then make a new commit. Add package.json. So if we look at our log history, we can see that I got 2 commits here now. But the important bit is that Azure gave us this URL to push to. Right now, my Git code only lives on my local machine. Right, you guys, this is not on GitHub or anywhere else that anybody has access to. But I'm going to add a remote. So the git remote command has a subcommand, I guess a sub-subcommand, add, that takes 2 arguments. Azure, which is the name of the remote. I can call this whatever I want, cloud host or whatever, but I'm going to call it Azure. That makes sense to me. And then the URL that they told us to use. So I just pasted that in. Now that Git knows about that remote endpoint that Azure set up for us, I can push to Azure's master branch. And it should ask me for my password. Hope I got it. Oh, I didn't get it. Got it that time. So this is kind of like what you do when you push to GitHub or push to TFS. Notice how here's a bunch of lines from NPM. It's downloading Express and EJS and body parser, and it finished. So back here in the web page, we can see that a deployment just happened at 2:19, and the comment on the commit was add package JSON. I'm the guy who did it. Pretty darn cool how they have this set up so that pushing to GitHub. Pushing to the cloud or deploying to the cloud is as easy as pushing to GitHub, right? You just type in that one command or press the push button in your IDE or your source control tool, whatever it is that you use. And now let's test it out. So the URL, what did I call it? It's called Express Intro. Express Intro.Azure websites. Is that? .com. Totally not it. Why am I spacing out? Site URL. Azure.net. It's not .com. Okay. Here it comes. It's usually slow the very first time. Oh, I did something. Oh, this is good. It's cool that I make mistakes. So that means that you don't have to. You hopefully will remember the mistake I made and not make the same mistake yourself. I'm listening on port 1337. Why? Because we copied that from the source code that came with that snippet from Node.js.org's homepage. But that's not the right port to listen on when we're hosting in Azure. You actually need to listen on the port they tell you to listen on. I looked into it a little bit, and they're actually using named pipes, and so the port isn't a number, it's this big funny-looking string. But you get that from process.env.port. And if that's not specified, we'll fall back to using 1337. So process.env is Node's way of giving you access to the environmental variables for your current application. And on Azure, they set this variable to whatever port they want you to listen on. And you don't have to know the actual number or the name pipe, since that's actually what it is. You just have to know what variable to get it from. So now that we have this, we should be able to save it. It should still work here. We're still listening on port 137 because I did not define that. But if I did set port equal to, I don't know, 8080, and then node app, now it's listening on port 8080, right? That's the idea here, is that you can set this environmental variable, and then you are listening on the right port. So let's git commit add use port. So I'm going to push to the Azure remote on the master branch. My password again. Since the package.json didn't change, it's using the same stuff that it got before. If we switch back to the management portal, we should see that a new deploy happened. Deployments. So here's the active deployment. It says use port. That was the latest comment. And I should be able to refresh, and hopefully it won't be blank. Yay. And we can add some stuff to it, post to the server, and it works. So we managed to push this to the cloud, and you could probably type that in yourself. I don't know why you'd want to bother, but you can see how easy it is. You don't have to give Microsoft money to use Node.js, of course. They make it easy for you, though. I don't see why you wouldn't be open to that if you wanted to be, have a nicer deploy experience and be able to leverage a lot of the services they offer. It's honestly, they're doing a fantastic job on Azure. But if you wanted to use something else, like Heroku is a popular alternative that doesn't rely on Windows. Azure seems to have followed a whole lot of Heroku's patterns. This whole thing with setting the port, getting it from your environmental variable, and then letting their router, their load balancer, route to the correct port, whatever it was they determined it to be. That I first saw on Heroku, but it's probably older than that. If you're into this kind of stuff, there's a website called 12factor.net that talks about what they call 12-factor apps, and this is written by people who I think worked at Heroku. So they documented what it means to be a 12-factor app, and that's a good word in their opinion. If you follow their 12 rules, then you're an app that can be scaled and deployed and managed in a good way, in modern practices, best practices. So our Azure is following a lot of these, it seems like to me. We just saw it work. Was there anything else we wanted to go over? Structuring large apps, deploying. One thing I'll mention is that sites like Heroku and Azure are the terms that people are gravitating towards are their platform as a service providers. So you've probably heard of software as a service. Platform as a service is one that is applicable to Heroku and Azure. Infrastructure as a service is applicable to stuff like Amazon EC2, Rackspace, DigitalOcean, where you are just given raw hardware and they say, yeah, go ahead and upload your Linux VM or your Windows VM or whatever it is here, and you can use our hardware. So in these cases, you have to do all the DevOps stuff yourself. You have to figure out how to deploy. You have to figure out how to take your site offline in a way that allows you to upgrade half of it while the other half stays running for the existing customers, right? The platform as a service providers take care of a lot of those details for you. But if you think that spending time on developing these things is worth the cost and savings, then DigitalOcean is very cheap. For as little as $5 a month, you can have a Node app running in their cloud. But you get to manage, install Linux yourself, install Node yourself, and install everything else yourself. So that's an option. When you're doing that, though, most people do not put Node apps directly on the internet. And they usually hide Node apps behind some load balancer or some reverse proxy. Nginx is probably the most popular one right now. It's quickly overcoming Apache as far as the most widely non-Windows used web server. And Nginx is really easy to configure it to be a reverse proxy. So when it gets a request, it detects that request can't be handled by itself. So it forwards it to the servers, the farm, if you will. Even you can have multiple servers that it round robins between, and it will use all the servers that are available in your farm. IIS has the exact same support for that too, using its URL rewrite plugin, I guess. We use this at my company, and not for production. So I don't want to claim that IIS and URL rewrite and on Windows and Node is production worthy. I haven't tested it in that way, but we use it for our staging and testing services. Haven't had a problem since we set it up. It's been working pretty well. IIS Node is a product that you may want to look at, which actually integrates Node as a first-class citizen into the IIS ecosystem. And this is actually what Windows Azure is using behind the scenes. So if you want a Windows Azure-like experience, but you want to host it on your own hardware, look into this. Just Google for IIS Node. It's a GitHub project that you can take advantage of. So summary, Express, the web application framework, it's a very simple framework. It's probably 1,000 or so lines of code. It's not that big, but it's not as gigantic as Rails, for example. Rails is huge, and if you don't want to write your apps the way they want you to write your apps, then you really shouldn't be using Rails. But Node takes the opposite philosophy, Node and Express. They're very minimal, and they give you just the bare building blocks in order to create your application the way you want to create it. Very much like how Owen and Katana, those new efforts from Microsoft are appearing. And so I feel like a lot of the inspiration for Owen came from frameworks like Express and Connect in Node, and even before then from Rack in Ruby and WSGI in the Python space. So Microsoft is really learning a lot from the open source community and hopefully making things interesting for us by providing opportunities to use these open source tools now on their platform. And it's really exciting. The last thing I wanted to show was that inside Visual Studio, I've got Visual Studio 2013 installed with, let me show this, the Node.js tools for Visual Studio. So a couple weeks ago, this came out as 1.0 beta. You can debug your Node apps. It has templates, so I just created a new project, JavaScript, Node.js. Let's make a basic Express application. Exactly what we're just talking about. And when it runs, the first thing it says is, hey, we see that you have some NPM dependencies. Do you want us to do that for you? And you can say yes. And now he's downloading these resources from NPM. If you change the output window to show the NPM output, you can see it downloading all that stuff. We look at the code that it generated for us. We got our app.js, a package.json. Those should sound familiar. There's a views folder. They got Jade files in them. Well, that's just my preference, not to like. I've never really given it a shot. It just looks funny to me. They've got the static resources here inside the public folder. I bet if we look inside app.json, app.js, I should say, we'll see that they're using the static middleware, and there it is. They've got some other middlewares being configured here. One of the main reasons I didn't want to use this was because the Node.js tools for Visual Studio is still using the old version of Express. If we open package.json, you can see it's using version 3.4.4, which is a little on the old side. I think 3.5 is actually newer on the 3.x branch, but 4.0.0 came out, I think it was only a few weeks ago. It's been in RC for a while, but I think it was officially released a few weeks ago. So keep in mind that there was a big change from the 3 series of Express to the 4 series of Express, and that might explain why you see different code in here than what you just saw me type in. But if you go to the Express website, which we have right here, up here in the corner, you can see the 3.x docs. And so here they've got docs for all the different middleware that comes embedded with Express 3, which was removed in Express 4. So other than that, the API didn't change a whole lot in 4. The router is new, and the middleware disappeared. Those are kind of the big changes to happen in 4. But if you use Visual Studio, if you're a Microsoft shop and you like its Git integration and its Node.js integration, it's not too bad. You even get some pretty good IntelliSense in here in order to, it's able to figure out the JavaScript. It's able to figure out the prompts for you. If you throw TypeScript on top of this, supposedly TypeScript will work just fine inside these Express templates. I don't have that installed, so I haven't taken the plunge into TypeScript yet. Just played with it a bit. And it looks like it might be fun, but that's about all I've got as far as content goes. I want to make it clear that if you have questions, I'll look through the questions right now, but if you have more questions, my email address is jdiamond@develop.com. So feel free to shoot me an email if you have questions about anything that you saw me do or say that wasn't clear. The recording of what you just saw, so that you can slow it down or pause, will be up in a couple of days. And everyone who registered, even those who didn't show up, should be getting emails saying when that's available. We'll also have links to the source code that you just saw me type in and the PDF of the slides that you saw me kind of go through, but not really go through. But you can look at them for reference material if you want after the fact. So I hope that was enjoyable. I'll now start checking out the questions. And is this recorded? Are you using WebStorm from JetBrains? So Arif asked that. I do use WebStorm at work, at my day job, which is not Developmentor. And WebStorm, it's totally, I don't want to say totally adequate, because that makes it sound like it barely meets the needs. It's really nice. And it works on a Mac and it works on Windows. It probably works on Linux too. And I've used it both on Windows and Mac. Here I was using, how do I get back there? I was using Sublime Text. So Sublime is just a plain text editor. It's got no IDE, no debugging, no source control integration, unless you add a bunch of plugins and manage that yourself. So WebStorm is really nice though. It's like $50. It's totally worth it. Is there a way to wildcard Git so that all Git requests can tell the user they need to post? I have issues with that question, Raveen. It'd have to be very limited. You can't say that all GET requests need to post. Maybe in like one subsection of your API, you may want to enforce that constraint. But GET's an important method, and there's a lot of cases where GET has to be used. When you have a link tag or a script tag inside your HTML, you got to use GET. The browser will never do a post, right? So if you're not talking about that, normal HTML web app stuff, but more like a JSON-based API, then you could. So you could type in something along, oops, this is the wrong Sublime. Let's go back to Windows. and type open Sublime. You could do something like app.get star. And then maybe, I don't know, did you say redirect? Because a redirect won't work. You can't redirect from a get to a post. But you could say something like send, what's the method? It's like 405, method not, the status code. 405, method not allowed. I forget what it's called, what the actual code is. But you might be able to do something like this, and that's the wildcard in Express. So you can use star. Let's check that. I'm going to feel bad if I get the name wrong, or the code wrong. So I like this site, http status.is, for quickly looking up the, 405 was right. So 405 is method not allowed. So you can kind of do that, but you're not going to be able to, in here, say redirect them to a post. You can't trick the browser into doing a post. That's just not part of the rules of HTTP. What is the editor I was using? I was using Sublime Text. How do you use Express.router middleware? How is it different from what you've shown? So hopefully you asked that before I showed it. Later on, we go back over here. We just said router.get instead, router.post instead of app. We exported the router, and then we used the router. So this thing right here may have been clear if I did something like, that's weird. Keyword layout. I'm still in the work. Var router equals, may have been clear if we saved it into a variable to do routes, something like that. So you just use the router that was exported from the other module. And what's kind of implied here is that this thing right here, router, is a function, right? It does look like a normal middleware. So pretty much everything in Express is a function, even though you don't invoke it like a function. You invoke it like it's an object with methods. In JavaScript, functions can have objects, properties with their own methods, and they have a bunch already. So hopefully, looks clear. Great presentation. Thank you very much. Azure supports IS as well. Yes, good point, John. They totally do. But I think they try to position themselves as more of a PaaS, but you're totally right. You can have your own custom images on Azure. They span both. Is it suited only for middleware environments? Sorry, Bhaskar, I need a little bit more context because I'm not sure what I was talking about when you asked that. Thank you, I'm going to ruin your name, Kanaka. Thank you very much. Okay, so interesting question from Vikram. How do you structure a large project? Are DDD and layered architectural principles applicable here? Absolutely. So what you just saw me do was the bare minimum. I try not to do anything intentionally sloppy or stuff that you would absolutely not ever do in an application, especially a small one. But in a large one, you need the extra practices. That's something like DDD or an architecture like the hexagonal architecture from, I'm forgetting the Alistair Coburn, or the onion architecture from Procise? I forget or Palermo. So all the different architectures that, if you're a fan of them, go ahead and use them. None of that changes here. Can you do unit testing? Absolutely. You just do it differently. You don't use Anyunit or MS Test anymore. You probably use, well, it depends. You probably use Mocha if you're testing server-side code. If you're testing client-side code, like an Angular app, you're using Karma or Protractor. So you just got to know the words to Google for in order to find the project that the communities are gravitating towards and using their tools. But as far as architecture goes, should you use DDD? Absolutely. To me, DDD is essential in any enterprise nowadays. And if you're not architecting in terms of stuff like bounded contexts and the ubiquitous language and shared kernels, if you're not using the patterns that book tried to give names to, then you're going to end up with the big ball of mud, like every other large-scale application that didn't put the effort into trying to architect it. But that's a much bigger talk than showing the mechanics of using expresses. So Never forget that stuff though. It's always applicable. So no question. Oh, thanks, Ed. I really appreciate it. Can you comment on MS Web API versus Node.js for API? So Gian is asking about MS Web API versus Node.js. It's kind of comparing apples and oranges. Web API is more of a framework on top of the platform. So Web API and Express would be an okay thing to compare. .NET and Node.js would be an okay thing to compare, but Web API and Node.js is comparing the wrong things. But I get what you're saying. So why would I choose one or the other? Why would I choose Web API over Express, Web API on .NET over Express on Node? There's no reason other than the team, the skills that you guys have got, what you're comfortable with, what you other like non-functional requirements, like how you plan on deploying. Do you plan on always deploying on Windows-based servers? Do you know your customers that you might be deploying to on site if they're going to be hosting your applications? Are they always going to be okay with Windows? Right? If all those things add up to using Windows, then go ahead and do it. As far as like comparing the feature sets of Express as a Web API-like framework versus Web API, to me, I'm fine with either. I like them both, which kind of puts me in a predicament because I kind of have to choose one or the other. You're either a Node.js developer or you're a Windows developer, .NET developer. You don't really do both at the same time. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but on my current project, we had some requirements that we wanted to be flexible in our deployment strategy, deploying to different clouds, whether they be Linux or Windows-based, but also be hosted on-site, on-premises, and the flexibility of Node being able to install on pretty much anything, including we sell embedded devices as well. So we can have our appliance that we can install into them and not have to pay the Microsoft tax. And a lot of those things added up to, let's try Node. And so we tried it and really liked it, and it's working well for us. But I'm not going to say one is better than the other. So if your team is a .NET based, use Web API. It's great to run. Thanks, John. See you. You're probably already gone. Okay, so Andrew basically asked the exact same question. Node.js over other frameworks such as .NET MVC. The advantages is just the community. I shouldn't say just the community. The community is a big part of it, is a huge part of it. And the openness that the Node community has, and the kind of freewheeling, like hacker-friendly, and I don't mean hacker in a bad way, like you can be hacked, but like your developer-friendly ecosystem that they've built up is really appealing to some people. I've been doing .NET development since .NET existed, since it first existed, and programming Windows for almost all of that. But at home, I mean, you can see I'm on a Mac right now. I don't have any Windows machines at home. I'm always in the command line, even on Windows, all day long at work. So I started on Unix, and that kind of stuck with me, even throughout my whole Windows career. And so to me, it's really appealing. It's just there's a different feel. Microsoft likes to control what frameworks you use, and sometimes they make decisions that actually hurt their customers. All we have to do is bring up Silverlight, and you know what I'm talking about. So if you don't want that entity, that Microsoft's like telling you what to do and how to do it, then Node may be an appealing alternative. But it's different. You have to really like JavaScript if you want to use Node. If you hate JavaScript, if you're one of those people who just can't stand it, then stay away. And that's totally cool to have that preference. It's got a lot of warts, and sometimes I hate it too. But for the majority of the time, me and JavaScript are good friends, and so Node kind of makes sense for me, given my background in Unix and just the way that I develop constantly on the command line on non-Windows platforms. It makes a lot of sense for me. Are there going to be some recording with sound of the presentation? Yes, Carlos. In a couple of days, you will get an email with a recording of everything you just saw and links to download the demo code and slides. So that's the end of the questions. I hope that was fun for everybody and that you got something out of it. Like I said, if you've got any more questions, you can see my email address right here. If you can find me on the internet, I barely blog I mean, I don't blog at all anymore. I barely tweet. It's just not my style. But I'm always happy to hear if you're using something or if you have questions. I can throw examples together really quickly using something like JS Fiddle, or even throwing a script together that you can use running inside Node. So thanks, everybody. I will hopefully see you with the next one, and keep an eye out for our emails, because we'll probably have webcasts on using Passport to do authentication in Node, and I think also we were talking about database, so using MongoDB and using a Mongoose to be like your entity framework in the Node world. So how do you store rich data in easy ways? So those are two are coming up. If you're interested in Node, then you'll probably be hearing from me again. So thanks a lot.